The park was alive with laughter. Children ran between balloons, their voices rising in bursts. A light breeze moved through the leaves, carrying the scent of sugar and cut grass. But he wasn't watching the children. His eyes were fixed on her. She stood near the playground fence, still, silent, and yet somehow shaking his entire world. Wrapped in a deep green coat, her hands rested just below her stomach, not as a casual gesture, but as something protective, possessive. He knew that posture. He had seen it once, briefly, in the way mothers looked at their children when they thought no one was watching. And now, it was her. Her. She turned slowly. Their eyes met. Time didn't slow. It didn't pause. It stopped. Her face had changed. Softer in some places, sharper in others. But her eyes, those eyes, held the same fire he once loved and the storms they never learned to weather. Only now, there was something else, a wall, a quiet fort built from 6 months of silence. And in that moment, he saw the truth. Her body wasn't just hiding under wool and posture, she was pregnant. What would you do if you found out your ex was carrying your child? After a brutal custody battle. If powerful stories like this stir something in you, hit the like button and subscribe, because this one's going to stay with you. He didn't move. Couldn't. The sounds of Elsie's birthday surrounded them. His daughter's laugh, so bright, so free, rung out nearby. Streamers fluttered. A clown juggled in the background, but all he could hear was the soft thud of his heartbeat in his throat. She looked away first. That simple motion sent something breaking loose inside him. He walked toward her, each step heavy with memories he hadn't dared touch since the final court date. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel path. He didn't know what he was going to say, only that he had to speak, had to know. When he stopped in front of her, she didn't smile, didn't greet him. She simply waited, like a verdict already written. He forced the words out. Is it mine? No anger, no accusation, just the weight of everything they'd been through packed into 4 words. She didn't blink. Her hand tightened slightly over her stomach, as if the truth lived there now, and she needed to shield it. There are truths we both ran from, she said quietly, but this one is mine to carry. She turned away then, her back to him, the same way she had walked away on the courthouse steps, gray coat sweeping, spine straight, leaving him behind. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't walking away alone. Before he became the man everyone feared in silence, he was a boy no one remembered. Born in the forgotten corner of a rusted burrow, he learned early that silence was safer than hope. His mother vanished before his 2nd birthday. His father, a shadow who came home smelling of sour bottles and broken promises, was the kind of man who left bruises, not bedtime stories. He never cried, not once, even when the hunger clawed at his ribs, even when he sat through winter nights wrapped in old newspapers near a cracked window. Emotions had no currency in that place. Survival did. By 16, he'd left. No note. No goodbye. Just the quiet creak of a back door opening and a vow never to return. What followed wasn't luck. It was obsession. He worked under tables, behind counters, between classes. He studied contracts, while others studied girls. He slept in borrowed offices, traded comfort for access, and by 21, he'd started his first tech firm. The one that failed, the second one didn't. It wasn't just profitable. It exploded. Security systems built on intuitive behavioral patterns, things he had learned watching people hide their fears. The elite called it revolutionary. He called it obvious. People were always trying to protect what they didn't understand. He built an empire before he ever built a home. He never flaunted his wealth. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried weight. Crisp shirts, clean lines, a voice like tempered glass. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. His name, Reese, became a warning, a myth, a challenge, depending on who said it and why. His assistants rotated like seasons. None stayed longer than 3 months. They either cracked under the pressure or tried to get too close. He kept his interactions brief, efficient, polite, but always with the underlying hum of disinterest. Because trust, to him, wasn't a gift. It was a liability. Aurora Falls wasn't where he was born. It was where he chose to rise. The city had no soul. That's what made it perfect. Skyscrapers stood like polished knives against a gray sky. The people smiled with their lips, but never their eyes. Money moved faster than truth, and loyalty was always for sale. He admired that. Aurora Falls didn't pretend to be kind. His penthouse was 29 stories above the street, glass-wrapped, artless, quiet. The kind of quiet that could only be bought, not found. Below him, the city kept moving, always cold, always watching. That view reminded him who he had become. The man who never let anyone in, the man who never lost. Until her. He didn't meet her in a boardroom, or through some polished introduction in a hotel lobby. No, she came into his life with a sound. Music. Real music. Raw and alive. He remembered walking through the room, one of those charity events that felt more like auctions in silk. He wasn't paying attention. He rarely did at those things. But then the notes started, not polished or soft. They roared and wept all at once, coming from a grand piano in the corner. Fingers moved like they belonged to the music, not the other way around. He turned, and for the first time in months, everything else faded. She was there, not graceful in the way society defined it. She didn't dress like the women who chased his last name. She wore deep blue velvet, her hair pinned loosely, her eyes half closed as though the sound itself took her somewhere else. And he didn't just notice her. He remembered her, not from a past life or a childhood crossing, but from something deeper, something he didn't even know he'd lost until that moment. It wasn't the beginning of love. Not yet, but it was the first time he stopped thinking about control. Before her, nothing touched him. After her, everything did. Still, no matter how far he climbed or how high he lived, there was always a room inside him locked from the inside, one that no deal, no merger, no title could unlock. He thought he'd buried that room, paved over it with acquisitions and dominance, but the day he saw her again, standing in that park, surrounded by balloons, and the sound of their daughter laughing, he realized something. That room had a door, and she still held the key. The first time he saw her, she wasn't looking at anyone. Her hands moved over the piano like they were chasing something only she could hear. Chopin filled the room, not softly, not sweetly, but like thunder with purpose. Every note came down like a decision. Every pause dared the world to breathe wrong. She didn't glance up, didn't notice the men in suits pretending to care about music, or the women leaning in too far for champagne. She was inside the music, drenched in it, commanding it. He stood just inside the threshold, one hand in his pocket, frozen. Her playing wasn't flawless. It was alive. There was something wild in it, like she wasn't performing, but remembering. Every movement had urgency, grace in conflict, a kind of beauty that made silence feel disrespectful. He didn't speak to her that night. He waited, watched, and when the last note lingered, she lifted her head, took a quiet breath, and left the bench with nothing but a nod to the staff. No applause, no vanity, just a woman walking out of a room she had just shaken. Her name was Solène Virel. He found it the next day, not because he was curious, because he was compelled. The conservatory listed her as a visiting artist from the South, piano instructor, no ties to the city's elite, no connections to its wealth. Just her. He remembered thinking her name sounded like a memory you never wanted to forget. The first conversation wasn't magical. It was awkward. He showed up to a student recital she was coaching. She caught him halfway through, standing near the back, like a man who didn't belong. Her voice was low, curious, and amused. "You lost, sir?" she asked. He could have lied, but her eyes wouldn't have let him. "I heard you play last night," he said. "I came to ask how you make something that precise feel that raw." She studied him for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Then, with a shrug and a smile, "I don't play for polish. I play to remember." Solène didn't come from privilege. She came from porch nights and red clay roads, from a family that sang at the table and argued during breakfast. Her mother had worked 2 jobs. Her father repaired church roofs. They couldn't afford a piano, so she practiced on paper keys her uncle had drawn on a table with marker. She spoke about it without shame, as if her roots weren't things to rise above, but to carry proudly. Where he lived in angles and silence, she filled rooms with sound and color. She could walk into a room full of strangers and find something familiar in all of them. She didn't hide from emotion. She met it head on and held its gaze. He didn't fall for her smile, though it stopped him the first time. He fell for the fire she didn't apologize for. Their romance wasn't built slowly. It happened all at once. They spoke in places that weren't meant for confessions. Parking garages, stairwells, the backs of quiet restaurants. Their lives didn't align, but their hearts seemed to sink in a rhythm only they could hear. She made him laugh without trying, and when he laughed, it wasn't measured. It startled him, like it had been waiting for permission. He took her to places he never let anyone see. Rooftops at night, his childhood neighborhood, abandoned and forgotten. She didn't judge, she only listened. Sometimes that was worse. She didn't try to fix him. She just held space for who he was, even when he didn't want to be seen. They made love without strategy, spoke without filters, argued without cruelty. Every emotion was sharp, but never careless. Their world was intense, sometimes too much, but never dull. She said once, "You scare me." "Why?" he asked. "Because you live like you've already prepared to lose everything, and I'm not something I want to be lost." He didn't answer that day. He kissed her instead. They married less than a year after they met. No press releases, no branded wedding photos, just a small ceremony in the Arboretum on the edge of the city. Her parents flew in. He invited no one. He said vows like he was signing a contract. She whispered hers like a poem. They danced under string lights. No music, just humming, and her head on his chest. In those early days, it felt like peace had found a home between them. He hadn't planned on it, hadn't trusted it, but he allowed it, because Solène made stillness feel safe. Until it didn't. The first sign wasn't a fight. Was silence, not the kind that follows shouting or slamming doors. This silence settled in like fog, soft, quiet, unnoticed at first, but eventually it blurred everything. They still ate breakfast together, still shared space, still exchanged goodnights and "I'll be home late." But something vital had slipped through the cracks. The music stopped. She no longer played in the mornings. He no longer asked why. Their schedules grew more demanding. Her teaching expanded into private recitals. His company was entering its most aggressive acquisition phase. Weeks passed where they barely shared a full day off. Conversations became logistics. Texts replaced touch. They weren't cruel to each other. They were careful. And in that care, something essential faded. One evening, she waited for him in the hallway. She had dressed simply, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. When he walked in, shoulders heavy with the weight of another deal, she looked up and asked the question she'd been holding in her chest for months. "Do you want a family?" He didn't answer right away. He sat down, loosened his tie, exhaled deeply, as if the question was a weight, not a wonder. "I don't think I'm ready," he finally said. Her heart stilled, not because of the answer, but because of how easily he gave it. No conflict, no hesitation, just clean detachment. She forced a smile, nodded, and walked into the kitchen. They didn't speak of it again for weeks. But the space between them grew louder. She brought it up again on their 3rd anniversary. They had dinner in the same restaurant they visited the night he proposed. The lights were dim, the air thick with quiet elegance. She wore ivory. He complimented her. He ordered her favorite wine. And midway through dessert, she tried once more. "I want children," she said softly. "I know. I want them with you." He looked at her then. Really looked. For a moment, his eyes softened, as if her words were reaching some part of him buried under the years. "I don't know how to be that," he said. "A father. I don't know what that looks like without failing." Her hand reached across the table. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try." But he pulled back, not harshly, just enough. Enough to let her know that wall was still there. In the months that followed, they began living in parallel. They shared a roof, a bed, a kitchen, but no longer a rhythm. She stopped leaving notes on his briefcase. He stopped bringing her flowers after meetings. They started watching television with subtitles, because neither was speaking. She cried once, in the bathroom, quietly, with the water running. She didn't want him to hear, not because she feared he would be cruel, but because she feared he wouldn't come in. And he didn't. He sat in the study that night, scrolling through merger proposals, pretending the silence wasn't deafening. He loved her. He knew that. But love wasn't the problem. It was the fear that he would pass on the same shadows he had been raised in, the same emptiness, the same aching silence. He didn't want to watch a child learn to flinch, didn't want to hear himself say the wrong thing and see it echo in young eyes. So he said nothing, did nothing, and silence did what time alone could not. It buried them. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning. She made coffee, set his mug on the counter, and asked, without looking up, "Do you think we're still us?" He didn't have an answer, so she left. Not that day, but soon after. No slammed doors, no screaming, no dramatic exit, just a suitcase, a gray coat, a final glance, and then she was gone. He stood in the living room for hours after she left, not moving, not calling, just standing in the silence they had both created. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was proof that love, left unattended, doesn't fade. It hardens, it waits, and eventually it walks away. She brought the child home on a Tuesday afternoon. There was no warning, no long conversation, just a soft knock at his office door, and her voice, gentle but certain, "I want you to meet someone." He looked up from his desk, expecting another guest performer or student from the conservatory. But instead, she entered holding the hand of a little girl, no more than 2 years old, big brown eyes, a threadbare giraffe doll, shoes a size too big. Her name was Elsie. She had been placed temporarily with Solène through a foster initiative tied to a music therapy program. The child didn't speak much, didn't cry, didn't smile, but she followed Solène with wide, curious eyes and clung to her scarf whenever strangers came close. At first, he kept his distance, not out of cruelty, out of fear. The girl was innocent, but the idea of attachment, of becoming someone's safety net when he never had one himself, that scared him more than anything. Why bring her here? He asked that night, watching Elsie sleep on the couch beside Solène. "Because she needs something solid," Solène said softly. "And so do we." He didn't touch the child for weeks. He'd nod politely, wave sometimes, but never linger, never initiate. But Elsie wasn't afraid of silence. She'd sit on the floor while he worked, arranging books into towers or humming to herself. And one evening, as he sat reading over legal contracts, he felt a tiny hand press a crayon into his palm. She wanted him to draw. He didn't know how to say no. So, he tried, and when she giggled at his terrible drawing of a cat, something shifted inside him. Not dramatically, just enough. Over time, the rhythm of the house changed. He began making breakfast for 3 instead of 2. Stopped locking his office door. He started reading children's books at night, at first awkwardly, then with voices and pauses that made her laugh so hard she'd snort and fall over. She started calling him Ree. Not quite Reese, but it stuck. He never corrected her. Solène noticed the change. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. 6 months later, they signed the adoption papers, not because it was easy, but because it felt right. Then came the divorce. It started with a slammed door. Solène had spent the night at her sister's place. He had missed Elsie's art show at school. Again, she came back the next morning with tired eyes and a bag packed for her and the child. "This isn't working," she said. "We're roommates. CO managers of a life we don't share anymore." He stood there, unsure whether to fight or fold, and she hated that most of all, how easy he made it to leave. The paperwork followed quickly. Lawyers, deadlines, meetings scheduled with precision, but filled with avoidance. They didn't fight over houses or accounts. They didn't argue over assets. They fought over Elsie. In court, he was the image of control. Tailored suits, measured speech, eyes fixed forward. But inside, he was coming apart. Every word she said felt like a blade. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He's a good man, Solène told the judge. But he disappears. Not physically, emotionally. I don't want Elsie growing up wondering if her laughter is too loud, or her needs too much. His attorney objected. He didn't, because he knew exactly what she meant. He presented his case. Stability, financial capacity, security. But as she sat in that courtroom, tears tracing the edge of her face, and Elsie colored quietly, in the corner he realized something brutal. He could offer everything, except presence. The ruling was swift. Sole custody awarded to Solène. Generous visitation to him. No contest. No appeal. Only silence. They met one final time to exchange documents. No lawyers. No courtroom. Just the two of them in a neutral office space. She wore a gray wool coat. Her scarf was wrapped high. Elsie played in the corner, humming softly. He handed her the final folder. She signed without looking up. "I loved you," he said quietly. She blinked, slow and deliberate. "I know," she replied, "but I needed more than love. I needed you." He watched them walk out. The coat. The small hand holding hers. The door closing. This time, it didn't slam. It whispered, and it took something with it that he would never quite get back. Ever loved someone so deeply, but didn't know how to show it? Comment, yes. If you've ever let something good slip away because you couldn't say the right words when it mattered. It had been half a year since the final signature, 6 months since the judge made it official, since the gray coat disappeared through the door, since he stood in that quiet office, holding nothing but a folder filled with failure. He had returned, almost immediately, to what he knew best, control. Mornings started at 5. Workouts were timed to the second. His schedule was a polished mechanism, meetings stacked without gaps, meals measured for efficiency, emails answered before dawn. His staff called it discipline, but really, it was distraction. The penthouse was colder now. Not in temperature, he kept it at a perfect 71, but in spirit. The laughter that once came from the hallway, the little footsteps racing toward the kitchen, the humming from a woman who had once filled the space with life. It was all gone. He didn't allow himself to miss them. He simply noted their absence. Twice a week, he saw Elsie. She'd come with a bag full of picture books and leave crayon drawings on his glass desk. He kept every single one in the top drawer, never pinned them up, never showed them off, but they were there, folded, preserved, proof. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Children have a way of reading silence louder than words. At night, he found himself staring at the empty side of the bed. He told himself it was about the habit, the adjustment of sleeping alone again. But it wasn't. It was the absence of a voice that used to speak into the dark. The way she used to lie on her side, one arm tucked under her head, asking him quiet questions about things no one else bothered to ask. Questions like, "Do you ever feel like success just made your loneliness harder to explain?" He'd never answered that one. He still didn't know how. The housekeeper mentioned it once, offhand. "You work too much," she muttered while arranging his suits. "This place feels empty." He didn't reply, not because she was wrong, but because agreeing out loud would make it real. The world still saw him as untouchable. The press kept printing his name next to headlines about corporate expansion, net worth milestones, new investments, but none of them saw the man who stood in the shower too long, as if water could rinse away regret. None of them heard the way he paused outside the guest room, the one that used to be Elsie's, and almost opened the door. Before walking away, none of them watched him scroll through photos of a woman who once played Chopin like her soul depended on it, or noticed that he hadn't listened to music in 6 months. Not once. The city moved on. So did the calendar, but something in him stayed right there, frozen on the day she left. It started with a pause, a small one, the kind people slip into conversation when they've just realized they've said something they weren't supposed to. He had been reviewing quarterly reports during a meeting with regional leads. The room was filled with people trained to keep their expressions neutral, their words precise. But as the conversation shifted from numbers to brand optics, a junior strategist, new, sharp, nervous, mentioned a feature article from a local publication. They wanted to include a piece about your ex-wife, he said, voice cautious. He didn't look up, and they said she declined. No explanation. Just disappeared from their contact list. She's not taking interviews anymore. Even pulled out of the conservatory schedule this season. The strategist realized too late that he had gone too far. Reese's pen paused over the page. The room stilled. He didn't respond, just turned the page and continued the meeting. But from that moment on, he stopped hearing half the numbers they gave him. A few days later, it came again, this time from someone who didn't realize what they were stepping into. His driver, an older man who had worked for him for years, rarely spoke unless spoken to. But on that particular afternoon, as they pulled up to the tower, the man glanced at him through the rearview mirror and hesitated. "Forgive me if I overstep," he said slowly, "but I drove past the conservatory this morning. They replaced the banner." Reese didn't answer. It used to be her on the left side, playing. A pause. They took it down. Still, silence. She was always kind, greeted me by name, asked about my grandson. He didn't mean anything by it, just an old man's voice carrying a bit of human warmth where it didn't belong. Reese nodded once, stepped out of the car, and didn't speak a word all the way up to his office. He told himself it didn't matter. She had always wanted her privacy. She had asked more than once to not be mentioned in his press coverage. She kept her life separate from his name. It wasn't new. It was her way of surviving his world. But this felt different. Solène hadn't just stepped away from publicity. She had vanished from everything. No recitals, no classes, no small weekend performances in the Park District. Her email signature had been removed from the conservatory staff page. Even her personal website redirected to a closed domain. He searched once. Late at night, the room lit only by the glare of his laptop. He found no recent updates, no posts, no online footprint newer than 4 months ago. As if she had drawn a line through her life and stepped into the blank space. He asked Elsie, gently, during one of their visits, "Has Mommy been okay?" Elsie nodded and went back to coloring. "She sleeps a lot now," she said absently. "She puts her hands on her tummy and says everything's going to be okay." He froze. "Tummy?" Elsie looked up, unfazed. "Yeah. She doesn't let me jump on the bed anymore. Says it's not safe." He didn't ask anything else. He couldn't. That night, he sat in the kitchen for hours. The apartment around him was perfect, quiet, clean, but his mind wasn't. Her hands, on her stomach. Her disappearance from the spotlight. The refusal to speak to reporters. Why hadn't she told him? Why was she hiding? More importantly, what was she hiding? He didn't sleep that night. And for the first time in months, the silence didn't soothe him. It scratched at the walls. The park looked exactly as it had last year. Streamers danced between trees. Children zigzagged through patches of grass with sticky fingers and helium balloons tied to their wrists. Somewhere near the tables, an off-key rendition of Happy Birthday drifted into the breeze. But he wasn't watching the decorations, or the cake, or the magician twisting animals from colored latex. His eyes had found her. Solène. She stood near the playground arch, half in shade, her coat slightly open at the front. She wasn't waving. She wasn't laughing. She was watching. Not him. Elsie. His daughter twirled in the grass, her laughter cutting through the late afternoon air. Her curls bounced with each skip as she chased a floating bubble, her arms outstretched toward the sky. Solène smiled, a quiet, small curve of the mouth, one she used to wear in the early mornings, when the world still felt soft. But there was something else. Her hand. It rested, no, pressed, against the fabric of her dress, not in thought, not in absent-minded habit. She was protecting something. No, not something. Someone. He froze, not just in movement, but in thought. His mind stopped categorizing, stopped rationalizing. It simply paused, mid-breath, because the shape under her palm wasn't ambiguous, not imagined, not guessed. It was unmistakable. His first instinct was denial, that it was the dress, the way she was standing, a shadow. But then she moved, just slightly, turning toward a group of parents gathered by the snack table. And the curve of her midsection was clear, rounded, real, already pronounced. 1,000 thoughts collided without structure. Who? When? Why hadn't she told him? How long had she been? And then, the most disarming, quietest question of all, is it mine? He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he watched her from the distance, like a man staring at a life he no longer had access to. She wore a long scarf, wrapped high around her neck, her posture softer than he remembered. She hadn't seen him yet. Her focus was on their daughter, who had begun handing out gift bags to her little guests. Elsie turned then and called across the park, "Mommy, look!" Solène laughed, really laughed, and clapped for her. That sound made his chest tighten. It had been months since he'd heard it. And then, finally, she looked up. Their eyes met. There was no shock, no smile, just recognition. She straightened slowly. Her hand stayed exactly where it was. He began walking toward her. Each step dragged old emotions to the surface: grief, confusion, longing. None of them neat, none of them finished. By the time he reached her, the park had faded from his awareness. The voices, the music, the balloons, all distant. She didn't speak first. Neither did he. Not until he couldn't hold the question anymore. Is it mine? No build-up, no pretense, just the question, bare, desperate, sharp at the edges. Her gaze didn't flinch. She took a breath. "There are truths we both ran from," she said quietly. "But this one is mine to carry." Her words weren't angry. They weren't cruel, but they held a boundary, clearly drawn. He stepped back, not because he accepted it, but because he didn't know how to challenge it without breaking something again. Elsie ran past them at that moment, waving a ribbon wand, her voice rising with excitement. Solène turned slightly, instinctively scanning the area to ensure no one was too close to her child. Her children, because that's what they were now. Not just Elsie, but another, unseen, unnamed, growing inside the only woman who had ever made silence feel sacred. He stayed only a little longer, just long enough to sing the birthday song with the others, hand Elsie her gift, and kiss the top of her head. Solène remained near the shade, greeting parents, thanking guests, never once looking back at him. As he walked back toward the car, he didn't feel anger. He felt something heavier, a question still hanging between them, unanswered. A future he hadn't planned for, now living just out of reach. He didn't leave the park right away. He told himself he needed to check his messages, that he had calls to return, but the truth was simpler than that. He couldn't drive. Not yet. His hands weren't steady. He sat in the car, engine off, the door slightly open to let the breeze in. Around him, the sounds of the celebration continued, children laughing, parents chatting, a speaker playing faint background music. But they felt far away, like memories echoing from a life he'd somehow stepped out of. His chest was tight, not like fear, more like something trapped, pressing upward, struggling to be acknowledged. He had stared down investors with billion-dollar stakes on the line. He'd faced audits, scandals, negotiations that would buckle most men. But none of those moments compared to this one. Not knowing, not having an answer. That was what broke him. He replayed her words in his mind. There are truths we both ran from, but this one is mine to carry. It was elegant, final, unbreakable. But it wasn't a no, and it wasn't a yes. It was a sentence wrapped in mystery and dignity, and it left him paralyzed. He drove past her neighborhood that evening. He didn't stop. He just slowed when he saw the porch light glowing, the faint silhouette of someone moving behind the curtains. Her. He saw her shadow press a hand gently over her abdomen before walking out of view. He couldn't breathe right for the next 10 minutes. By midnight, he had gone through every possible memory that could provide a clue. The timelines lined up. The night of the final hearing. the way she had looked at him before walking away, the way they had met, not in bitterness, but in something more vulnerable, not angry, but exhausted, quiet. And then, what they did, what they shared. He remembered how she had kissed him, not with finality, but with familiarity, like someone who wasn't ready to let go, even as she was packing to leave. And now, she was carrying something that felt like consequence and miracle all at once. The next day, he showed up at her door. No text, no warning, just the click of the doorbell in the morning quiet. When she opened it, she didn't look surprised. She didn't look anything, just still, just calm. She stepped outside before he could speak, closed the door behind her, maybe to keep Elsie from hearing, maybe to keep him from seeing too much. "I need to know," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Please." She looked at him for a long time. The breeze tugged lightly at the loose ends of her sweater. Her hair had grown longer, or maybe it had always been this length, and he just hadn't been close enough to notice. She didn't answer. So he tried again. "When did you find out?" "About 6 weeks after everything was finalized," she replied. "I thought it was stress. Then I realized it wasn't." He swallowed hard. "And you didn't think I had a right to know?" "I thought about telling you every day," she said. "But I also thought about how much it hurt to be invisible while I was still in your life. What would have changed by hearing from me after I left?" His jaw tightened. "I'm not the same person I was." "No," she interrupted. "You're still becoming him. And maybe one day you'll be ready. But I couldn't gamble this child's stability on a version of you that might never arrive." The words hit like a confession and a warning. He had no defense. More questions. "Is it mine?" Pause. A long one. She didn't blink, didn't shift. "There are truths we both ran from," she repeated quietly. "But this one is mine to carry." The echo of those words wrapped around him like a thread he couldn't pull loose. He wanted to press, to demand, to insist that he had the right to know. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was protective. Resolute, not just of herself, but of what she was guarding now. "I never stopped loving you," he said, softer than he meant to. She looked down. "I know," she whispered. That was never the question. They stood there for another minute, not speaking, not moving, just standing in the space between who they had been and who they were now. When he turned to leave, she didn't call him back, and he didn't ask her to reconsider. Some answers didn't arrive all at once. Some answers had to be earned. He told himself it wasn't true. Even after standing in front of her, even after hearing her measured words, even after seeing the way her hand moved instinctively to shield what was no longer just hers. It had to be a coincidence, a misunderstanding, a miscalculation of timing, a situation he wasn't truly part of. He had spent years teaching himself how to think around pain. Now, he was doing it again. The next morning, he couldn't focus. He sat through 3 meetings without remembering a single outcome. Someone presented new design metrics. Another discussed investor timelines. He nodded, approved, signed. None of it landed. The only thing he saw was her face, that still, unshaken expression as she spoke words that held both care and distance. "This one is mine to carry." It shouldn't have hurt, but it did. By afternoon, he was on the phone. His assistant didn't question him when he asked for a private security contact. They'd worked together long enough for her to know when his voice had no room for negotiation. 2 hours later, a man in a plain blazer arrived with a notepad and a calm tone. "I want to know where she goes, who she sees, what her schedule looks like." "I want clarity," Reese said. The investigator gave a small nod. "And the child?" His throat tightened. "I want confirmation." He didn't leave the office that night, just sat behind his desk with the lights dimmed, replaying the last time they were together. It was the evening after the final custody hearing. She had come to collect Elsie's clothes, leftovers from her time in the guest room. Neither of them had expected to see each other, and yet, somehow, neither left right away. They talked, really talked, not about court filings or logistics, but about how it all fell apart. She admitted she still cried in the car sometimes. He confessed he didn't know how to sleep anymore. They shared tea. Then silence. Then something else. A moment of closeness that shouldn't have happened, but somehow did. She had leaned into him, not for comfort, but connection. They didn't speak after. She left the next morning before sunrise, leaving only the soft imprint of her warmth in the sheets. He had buried that memory under business calls and cold routines. Until now. Now, it rushed back like a truth that no longer asked permission to be felt. The report came back in 4 days. It was clean. No red flags, no other man, no hidden agenda, just a record of her days, morning walks, music classes for Elsie, medical visits spaced every other week. One entry stood out, obstetric checkup. He stared at the page for nearly a full hour. She had gone alone. No emergency contact listed, no one accompanying her. That night, he wrote an email to his attorney. Drafted, deleted, rewrote. He considered requesting a court-ordered paternity test. He hovered over the send button, then closed the laptop. It wasn't the fear of legal complications that stopped him. It was the image of her, standing in the kitchen with both hands on her stomach, saying nothing but speaking everything through her eyes. To force something now would break whatever fragile peace still remained between them, and he wasn't sure if he could survive breaking her again. Instead, he drove, late, aimless, through streets they used to walk, past restaurants where they used to order too much and pretend they wouldn't finish it, past the bookstore where she once bought Elsie her first picture book, and he had watched them sit on the floor reading for almost an hour without saying a word. He passed the music hall where she'd once been offered a solo performance, and turned it down because she didn't want to be away from home too long. Back when they still had a home together, he pulled over near the lake just outside the city, got out of the car, stood by the water's edge with the wind brushing past his collar and the weight of too many choices pulling down his spine. He realized something standing there, staring at the black water. He hadn't just lost her because he couldn't be a father. He'd lost her because he couldn't admit how much he needed to be one. Not just for the child, for himself. Hit that like button if you've ever learned a hard truth too late. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional life lessons like this one. He got back in the car after nearly an hour. No destination in mind, but maybe, for the first time in a long while, a direction. It started with an extra visit. He hadn't asked. Solane had simply texted, "Elsie's school play is Friday. If you'd like to come." There were no emojis, no hope you're well, just information, offered without expectation. He replied with a single word, "Yes." She didn't speak to him much at the event. They sat 4 chairs apart in the audience. Her hair was pinned back, simple and elegant. He noticed she kept her hand resting gently over her belly, more out of habit than caution. When the curtain opened and Elsie walked onto the stage, wearing cardboard wings and a crooked crown, he smiled without thinking. And when Solane laughed at Elsie's exaggerated bow, he found himself watching her instead of the performance. He didn't mean to. It just happened. Afterward, Elsie ran to them, cheeks flushed, glitter in her hair. They walked her to the car together, side by side but not close. It was Solane who broke the silence. She was nervous last night, said she didn't want to forget her lines. She didn't, he said quietly. She was perfect. Solane smiled. She'll be happy to hear that. They stood there a moment too long, not awkward, not comfortable, just suspended. "I'm glad you came," she said, and that was it. But it was more than enough. The visits came more frequently after that. She never denied him time, never restricted access. She just let things unfold. Sometimes he picked Elsie up from school. Other times, they had short dinners at the park. There were puzzles spread across coffee tables, finger-painted pictures that came home on construction paper. He noticed the way Elsie would glance between them when they were in the same room, as if checking the weather, and slowly, it began to shift. There were moments now, not grand, not planned, moments, like when he fixed the broken handle on the kitchen cabinet without being asked, or when she returned from a doctor's appointment and found a brand new rocking chair assembled in the nursery corner. No words, just gestures that filled the spaces silence once claimed. One evening, as he helped Elsie into her pajamas, she leaned in and whispered, "Mommy doesn't cry in the bathroom anymore." He froze, hand still on the edge of her sleeve. "Did she do that a lot?" he asked softly. Elsie nodded. "Only when she thought I was asleep." He tucked her in gently, brushed the curls away from her forehead, and kissed her cheek. Then he sat outside her door for a long time, hands folded, listening to the stillness of a house that no longer felt like a stranger's. Solène found him there. "Long day?" she asked. He didn't look up. "She told me you used to cry in the bathroom." A pause, then simply, "Yes, I did." He turned his head slightly, studying her face in the low hallway light. "I didn't know. You didn't ask." The words weren't sharp, just true. He nodded once. "I'm sorry." She exhaled, then sat beside him. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes, but her shoulder brushed his, and she didn't move it away. Later that week, she invited him to stay for dinner, just once. He helped set the table, watched her move through the kitchen like she used to, barefoot, sleeves rolled, her hair loose down her back. Elsie talked the entire meal. About school, about books, about how the baby was probably going to be noisy. Kaylin asked questions, listened, smiled. Solène watched him with something almost unreadable in her eyes. Not affection, not mistrust, something in between. A quiet remembering. That night, as he pulled on his coat, he turned to her. "Thank you for letting me in a little." She nodded, but didn't speak, until he reached the door. "You left because you thought you couldn't be a father," she said. "But the man I see now? He reads bedtime stories, fixes broken chairs, shows up without being asked." He didn't answer, not because he disagreed, but because her words lodged somewhere deep, where old guilt and new hope were learning how to live beside each other. He drove home, in silence. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Elsie was at a neighbor's birthday party. Solène had offered him coffee before he left, and he had accepted without thinking. They sat in the living room. No music, just the hum of a distant lawnmower and the ticking of a clock on the wall. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes calm, shoulders relaxed, hands folded around her cup. "I have something to tell you," she said. He knew, not the details, but the weight in her voice was familiar. It was the same tone she used the night she told him she wanted a child. "I didn't mean to keep it from you," she continued, "but I needed time, space, to figure out what I was willing to risk." He set his cup down, didn't interrupt, didn't shift, just waited. "The baby is yours." The words were soft, final. She didn't elaborate, didn't try to soften the blow or build a cushion of excuses around the truth. She just let it sit, and for a moment, neither of them moved. His jaw clenched, not out of anger, out of the sheer force it took to stay still when everything inside him surged toward regret. "I thought I lost you that night," he said quietly. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped between his knees. "That night," he said, "do you remember how quiet it was?" She nodded. "I remember everything about it." Flashback. 6 months earlier, the apartment had been too silent after the hearing. Solène had come by to pick up Elsie's last few things. Toys, books, a drawing taped to the refrigerator. They didn't argue. They didn't revisit the courtroom. He made tea. She accepted it. For the first time in months, there was no armor between them. He apologized, not for the decision, but for how absent he'd become. How much of her effort had gone unseen. She cried, but not loudly, just the slow kind that comes from exhaustion rather than pain. He reached for her hand without thinking. She let him. They didn't speak when it happened. No promises, no planning. Just two people standing in the wreckage of something they once built, finding one last moment of closeness before walking away. Afterward, she lay with her back to him, eyes open, staring into a future neither of them could name. He held her, not like a man ready to let go, but like one who had already lost and didn't know how to say it. By morning, she was gone. He told himself it was just closure. But now, sitting across from her, he realized it had been a beginning. Present day. He ran a hand over his face, not to hide, but to feel something solid while everything inside him shifted. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, she replied. This wasn't a trap. I didn't keep it from you to punish you. I needed to be sure you were someone who chose to show up, not someone dragged in by obligation. He nodded slowly. I want to show up. She looked at him, long and searching. For him? She asked. For all of you. There was no embrace, no triumphant music, just two people sitting in a living room, the truth finally spoken. And for the first time in a long time, silence didn't mean distance. It meant understanding. The waiting room was warmer than he expected, not in temperature, but in feeling. Muted walls, soft chairs, a bowl of lollipops on the counter next to a faded stack of parenting magazines, the sound of quiet murmurs and the occasional name being called. He sat beside her, not too close, not distant. His palms rested on his knees. Her hands were tucked over her stomach, fingers gently interlaced. Neither said much, but she didn't stop him from coming. And that was enough. When the nurse called her name, she stood without hesitation. He followed. Inside, the lights were soft. The doctor greeted them with ease, explaining the procedures, asking questions, noting answers. Solène handled most of it. Calm, grounded. But then came the sound, a flicker of movement across the screen. A heartbeat. Fast. Sure. It filled the room. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until she looked at him and gave a slight nod, as if to say, You're allowed to feel this. After the appointment, they sat in his car for a moment before going separate ways. You didn't have to come, she said, her voice quiet. I wanted to. She glanced down at the sonogram photo in her hand. Well, thank you, he nodded. Before she stepped out, he asked, Would it be all right if I came to the next one? She didn't answer immediately. Then she tucked the photo into her bag and said, Yes. He didn't plan to buy the cottage. It started as a search for somewhere smaller, simpler, closer. He wasn't ready to move away from the city entirely, but he didn't want to be an hour away from his child's first breath either. The property sat just 15 minutes from Solène's place. White fence, single floor, a modest garden out front. The interior needed work, but the bones were solid. Wooden beams, a fireplace, a place where noise didn't echo. It lived. He signed the papers without fanfare. When he showed Solène the address, she blinked twice, then asked, You're moving here? He shrugged, unsure what answer she wanted. I just want to be near. She nodded. No argument, no praise. But later that night, she texted him a picture of a used bookshelf sitting by the curb. Thought this would look good in your cottage, she wrote. He started taking calls from the back porch instead of the office. He cooked for himself more, drove Elsie to school a few mornings, sent Solène links to prenatal classes without pushing her to attend. She began responding with suggestions of her own. A baby monitor brand, a pediatrician with a calm presence. He read every article she sent, not because he felt obligated, because he didn't want to miss this. They didn't call what they were doing getting back together. There was no label, only the small, persistent return of trust, like light coming back slowly after a long storm. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the bench outside the cottage. Unannounced, uninvited. She had her shoes off, feet up, ankles crossed. He opened the door with a raised brow. You all right? She smiled. I wanted to see if it felt real. And it does. She walked inside, ran a hand along the hallway wall. You're different here. He followed her with his eyes. Maybe this is who I was supposed to be all along. She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. That evening, they shared dinner on the back porch. No candles, no occasion. Just 2 plates, a quiet breeze, the smell of rosemary chicken between them. As the sun dipped below the trees, she leaned her head back and sighed. I didn't think I'd be able to sit with you like this again. He looked at her, not to study, not to weigh, but simply to be present. I almost didn't let myself change, he said, because I thought if I did, it would mean admitting how much I got wrong. She glanced over. But you did change, and I'm still trying. Her eyes softened. That's all I ever asked. The plates remained on the table long after the food was gone. Neither of them in a rush to leave, neither of them pretending anymore. The room had been empty for weeks. Just a quiet square at the back of Solen's house. Walls bare, corners untouched, the air still. But now, it smelled like fresh paint. A soft, warm cream color rolled slowly over the dull white surface, guided by his hand while she knelt nearby, trimming the baseboards with careful precision. They worked without music, without chatter, just the sound of brushes against drywall, the occasional clink of a metal can, the kind of silence that didn't push them apart, but pulled them into the same rhythm. You always painted too carefully, she said, eyes narrowed at his slow strokes. And you always rushed the edges, he replied without looking at her. She gave a quiet laugh. Because I finish before midnight. He smiled, a real one, and dipped the roller again. Elsie peeked in halfway through the second coat. She wore a paper crown and mismatched socks, her arms crossed like a supervisor evaluating progress. This is boring, she declared. It's necessary, Solen said, dipping her brush again. Elsie walked in, looked around, then pointed to one wall. That should be blue. Reese raised a brow. You don't even know if the baby's a boy or girl. She shrugged. Blue's nice. Blue is nice, Solen agreed. But we already bought the cream. Elsie walked up to the paint tray, stared into it for a moment, then said, thoughtfully, I think the baby's going to like snacks more than colors. They both laughed, not just a chuckle, a laugh that filled the room, unforced. Easy, like it used to be. They let Elsie help with a small section. She painted a stripe that started strong and quickly wobbled, ending in a handprint on the lower wall. Reese reached for a cloth, but Solen stopped him. Leave it. He paused. It's crooked. It's hers, she said. Let it stay. He looked down at the smeared line, then at the little girl who now twirled in the hallway, humming something out of tune. All right, he said, and left it alone. As the sun shifted across the windows, the room slowly transformed, not just in color, but in feeling. The air no longer felt untouched. It felt lived in, expected. They sat on the floor once the tools were packed away. No furniture yet, just the quiet company of two people who had weathered too much and still chose to show up. Solen leaned back against the wall, ankles crossed in front of her. Reese sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. The light caught flecks of paint on her arm. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped a tiny spot from her cheek. She didn't move away. She asked me yesterday if the baby would call me the same thing she does, he said suddenly. Solen turned to look at him. What did you say? I told her I didn't know yet. And how did she take that? She said it's okay. As long as she still gets to read stories with me on Wednesdays. Solen smiled, eyes soft. She asks a lot of questions now. He nodded. She used to be quiet. She used to be unsure, Solen corrected. Now she's watching us and learning how to speak from it. The words landed with more weight than either of them expected. Because it was true. This, whatever they were building, it was teaching Elsie something about forgiveness, about presence, about what real love looks like when it's not hiding. I didn't think I'd be here, he said after a moment. Painting? She asked, teasing gently. No, he replied. Here, with you, making space for something I was too afraid to want. She didn't answer, not right away. Then she reached for the crumpled water bottle beside her, took a sip and said, Well, I'm glad you are. They sat a little longer until the walls dried. The scent of newness in the air, the sound of Elsie humming again in the hallway, the weight of the past not erased, but finally becoming something softer. The first snow came in late November, not a storm, just a quiet dusting, a gentle layering over rooftops, parked cars, tree branches, the kind of snow that didn't disrupt but decorated. Reese stood at the window of the cottage, mug in hand, watching flakes drift beneath the porch light. Inside, the house felt different now. It was warm, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Books stacked by the fireplace, colored pencils in a tin on the table, a pair of slippers that weren't his by the door. It was no longer just a place he stayed. It was starting to feel like a place that held them. Solène moved through the kitchen, slow and graceful, one hand on her belly, the other balancing a plate of cookies Elsie had insisted they bake. "Don't let her eat more than 2, she said, setting them down beside him. "She already had 3, he replied. Solène raised an eyebrow. "I lost count," he added, not even trying to sound convincing. She smirked and turned toward the hallway, her voice trailing after her. "I'm blaming you when she can't sleep." He found Elsie curled up in the big chair in the nursery, her feet dangling. Off the side, a book in her lap and cookie crumbs dotting her shirt. "Ready for your story?" he asked. She looked up. "Can we read the one with the owl again?" For the 5th time. "It's about trust," she said, drawing out the word as if it carried great meaning. He raised his hands in surrender and settled beside her, opening the book to the familiar first page. Solène hummed softly from the hallway, folding tiny clothes into a drawer. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a simple tune. Gentle, steady, the kind of sound that filled the space between moments. He read, voice low and even, letting the rhythm carry them both. Elsie didn't make it to the last page. She fell asleep somewhere around the owl's second journey. Her hand rested on his arm, her breath steady. He closed the book, adjusted her blanket, and turned off the light. As he stepped into the hallway, Solène was waiting. "I heard every owl," she said, arms crossed, smiling. "She requested it," he replied. "She always does." They moved into the living room without speaking. Outside, the snow had thickened. Inside, the fire glowed. The tree by the corner was already half decorated. Ornaments that didn't match. A paper angel Elsie made from glitter and glue. Solène settled onto the couch. He joined her, a few inches of cushion between them. She looked at the fire. He looked at her. Then she reached for his hand. Just like that. No ceremony. No pause. Fingers interlaced. For a moment, he couldn't speak. When he finally did, the words came carefully. "I can't promise I won't stumble again." She turned to him, her face calm. "I'm not asking you to be perfect." Her thumb brushed his knuckle. "I just want the truth, even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy." He nodded, throat tight. "Then, I'll tell you this," he said. "I don't know how to do all of it, but I want to. I want to try." They sat there for a long time. Fire crackling, snow falling, hand in hand, not because it solved everything, but because it meant everything wasn't lost. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man trying to fix something broken. He felt like someone building something new. What's more powerful than second chances? Let me know your thoughts below. Later, as the fire dimmed and the house settled into sleep, Reese stood once more at the window. Snow still fell, but now the cold didn't touch him. Not here, not anymore. The sky was a pale gray that morning. The light barely broke through, filtered by thick clouds that softened the edges of the world. The roads glistened, not from storms, but from a steady mist that fell in silence, soaking the sidewalks and rooftops of the town. Reese sat rigid in the waiting room chair, fingers laced together, staring down at his palms, as if trying to memorize every line they held. It had started just before dawn. Solène had nudged him gently in the dark. "It's time," she whispered, voice calm despite the pain. He had grabbed the bag, helped her to the car, and driven with a focus so intense he didn't speak once. Neither did she. But she held his hand the entire ride, her grip tightening with every mile. Now, hours later, he found himself in a pale blue room filled with sterile light and sharp smells. Nurses moved quickly. Monitors beeped rhythmically. He'd been in control of so many things in his life, empires, contracts, people. But here, there was no boardroom to command, no assistants to delegate to, just Solène, lying in that bed, and the life they'd created together, pushing its way into the world. He stood beside her, trying not to show the worry weighing down his chest. Her face glistened with sweat, jaw clenched, breath quick and shallow. "You're doing so well," he whispered, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. She gripped his hand, nodded once, and exhaled. Another contraction came, and another. Time lost its shape. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. He didn't know how long it took. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. But when the cry filled the room, sharp, strong, new, everything else fell away. A nurse moved quickly, wrapping the newborn in a soft white blanket. Reese's knees nearly buckled. He wasn't prepared. Not for this sound. Not for the weight of what it meant. The nurse approached Solène first, placing the bundle against her chest. She smiled through tears, her face glowing with something he didn't have a name for. Then she looked up. "Do you want to hold him?" Reese hesitated. His hands had held power. Deeds, settlements, banknotes, never something this small. He stepped forward, carefully. The nurse shifted the child into his arms. He expected fear, panic. Instead, he felt stillness, heavy, fragile. The boy's tiny fingers curled instinctively, wrapping around one of his. That was all it took. Reese bent his head and let the moment take him. He didn't cry often. Years of training himself to harden, to brace, to shield. But now, tears came quietly, freely, streaking down his face as he stared at the boy he never expected to have, but couldn't imagine losing. Solène reached over, touched his arm. "He has your eyes," she whispered. Reese looked up, met her gaze, and nodded. "I didn't know I had this in me," he said hoarsely. She smiled. "You always did. You just didn't trust it." He looked down again, the baby's breath soft against his chest. "I want to get this right," he said. "You will." Later, after the nurses had cleaned the room and dimmed the lights, Reese sat in the corner chair, the boy asleep against his chest. The hospital was quiet. No sounds of traffic, no voices, just the soft rhythm of breathing. He wasn't the same man who had signed divorce papers in a suit worth more than the average home. He wasn't the same man who walked away when things got complicated. He had changed, slowly, unevenly, but deeply. Now he sat here, not because he had to, but because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. He used to rise with silence. His mornings began with spreadsheets, espresso, and a brief nod to his reflection in a mirror that never judged. Reese had been a man who managed time in blocks, not moments. 5-minute intervals, 10-minute briefings, 15-minute margins for error, though there rarely were any. That life hadn't disappeared. It just now included diapers and a faint milk stain on his lapel. The first time he tried to swaddle Leo, it looked more like a burrito with limbs. Too tight, Solène had warned, unwrapping the baby gently. He's a newborn, not a prisoner. The second attempt wasn't much better. By the third day, Reese had watched enough tutorials to lead a masterclass. "Fold, tuck, secure," he whispered to himself as he worked the soft cotton. "Blanket like origami," Leo blinking up at him with sleepy indifference. "Perfect," Solène said from the doorway. He looked up, waiting for sarcasm, but she was serious. Board meetings had also changed. His assistant tried, once, to suggest rescheduling a quarterly review because Leo had a fever. Reese stared at her, expression flat. "I'm not moving it," he said. "I meant for you to stay home," she clarified. He looked at the baby carrier slung over his shoulder. "He's coming." And he did. The room fell silent when Reese walked in, wearing a custom wool suit. Hair, perfect, eyes sharp, and a pale green burp cloth draped over one shoulder. He adjusted Leo's pacifier before pulling up a chair. No one dared comment. They didn't need to. The visual alone rewrote years of assumptions. The man who once barked at interns for using the wrong font now rocked an infant while discussing investment shifts. He didn't soften in his strategy. He didn't lower his expectations. He just now paused mid-sentence if Leo whimpered. At first, it confused people. Then it inspired them. "I can't believe you're doing this," one partner whispered during a coffee break. Reese looked up from burping Leo, who had just spit up on a Hermes tie. "Doing what?" "This," The man gestured. You, baby, diapers, all of it. Reese wiped his tie with a wet cloth and said, "Because it matters." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Back at the cottage, he was no longer the man who came and went with a rigid schedule. He was present. He changed midnight diapers while half asleep. He learned the specific way Leo liked to be rocked. Left shoulder, soft sway, low hum. He grew comfortable with baby monitors and late-night pacing. He started to laugh more. Solène would catch him gazing at Leo like he still didn't quite believe he was real. One morning, Reese stood in front of the mirror again. Only this time, there was a burp cloth over his shoulder and a bottle in his hand. Leo had just fallen asleep, cheek pressed against his father's collarbone, mouth slack with peace. Reese met his own reflection, but didn't nod like he used to. He just stood there, holding his son, the corner of his mouth lifted in something between pride and disbelief. That image said more about him now than any title or number on a screen. A man reshaped not by loss, but by love. The trees had bloomed overnight. One day they were bare, branches stretched like open hands. The next, they were draped in soft pink, petals whispering from the limbs like secrets only spring knew how to keep. The garden was still, no music, no podium, just the sound of wind moving through blossoms and a narrow stone path lined with folding chairs filled only by those who mattered. Solène stood beneath a wooden arch, wrapped in linen and blush blooms. Her dress simple, lace along the sleeves, her hair in loose waves. Her hands held a bouquet of wildflowers that Elsie had helped pick that morning. She didn't wear jewels. She didn't need to. Reese waited for her, dressed in charcoal, a white shirt, no tie. A man stripped of pretense. His eyes never left her as she walked. And just behind her, skipping softly with a basket in hand, came Elsie, a crown of daisies atop her curls, a gap-toothed smile wide with excitement. With every few steps, she tossed a handful of petals. Some hit the ground, others the air, some clung to her dress. She didn't care. She was beaming. She was home. There was no officiant in robes or clergy in sight. Just a friend, standing close, holding a small booklet in a softer voice. "Today isn't about promises for the world to witness," the friend began. "It's about promises already made in the quiet." Reese took Solène's hands, and for a moment, it was as if the garden paused with them. He looked at her, not like a man reciting words, but like someone trying to hold still the most meaningful second of his life. "When I first met you," he said, "I didn't know how to love gently. I only knew how to build, how to protect, how to control." Solène's fingers pressed into his. "But you taught me. Love isn't control, it's trust." He took a breath. "I've broken things, hurt you in ways I will carry always. But from this day, I choose to be soft where I was once hard, to listen, to stay, to love without fear." Solène's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she answered, "I didn't fall in love with perfection," she said. "I fell in love with the man who tried, even when he didn't know how." A slight breeze lifted the hem of her dress. "I've seen you at your highest, and I've held you at your lowest, and still, I choose you. Not because you've changed, but because you're changing. With me." The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't grand, but they were real. More sacred than anything written by a stranger. Elsie stepped forward with the rings, one in each hand. She placed them into her parents' palms, her face serious, as if she understood the importance, more than many adults ever could. They exchanged bands, kissed softly, and held each other in a silence louder than any applause. There were no photographers, no reporters, no city headlines, just family. And a boy asleep in his grandmother's arms, his tiny fingers curled against her scarf. Afterward, they didn't dance a first waltz. They sat on the grass with Elsie and Leo, eating fresh bread and fruit, and telling stories about how far they'd come. Solène laughed, head back, eyes crinkling. Reese watched her, hand resting over hers. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. He hadn't lost years. He had finally arrived at them. Reese stood on the back porch of the cottage, hands resting on the wooden railing. watching the sun rise in fragments between the trees. He'd been awake for hours, no surprise there. The baby had stirred at 3:14 a.m., demanding attention in that tiny commanding voice that could rattle the walls. Solène had handled the feeding, and he the slow, shoulder-rocking sway that now came as naturally as breathing. Inside, he heard a quiet shuffle, probably Elsie sneaking to the kitchen for a piece of fruit before breakfast. The house had its rhythm now, a music that didn't come from grand pianos or business calls, but from the quiet consistency of people choosing one another over and over again. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He had changed, not in some overnight light switch kind of way, but in the ways that mattered most. He had shifted. He used to think love was something you earned with grand gestures, with showing up when it was convenient, with expensive apologies. He now knew better. Love was made in the unspoken things, in the daily showing up, in the cracked voice at 4 a.m. whispering, "I've got him." It wasn't flowers at the door after a mistake. It was taking accountability before one happened. It wasn't winning arguments. It was listening when your instinct said to defend. He had once built towers to protect himself, but it was Solène who showed him how strength was also in stillness, in sitting across from someone who hurt you and choosing grace instead of distance. He thought of her now, still asleep most likely, curled next to Leo's crib. She had a way of sleeping that made her seem weightless, as if her worries unhooked themselves and hovered above, waiting for morning to return. She had always been his balance, his opposite, but not to counter him, to center him. It was her voice that had softened his harsh silences, her courage that confronted his avoidance, her steadiness that made space for him to stumble without fear of being left behind. He had once feared fatherhood, feared being the kind of man who made promises he couldn't keep, who loved with one hand while keeping the other on the exit door. But now his hands were full of bottles, bedtime books, paint from yesterday's cardboard box rocket Elsie had insisted on building, and they were fuller than they had ever been. He didn't want perfection anymore. He wanted presence. He wanted the scraped knees and baby giggles, the early mornings and spilled cereal, the quiet nights on the porch, the smell of Solene's shampoo in the pillow beside him, the weight of Leo asleep on his chest. Love wasn't a performance. It was participation. It was apologizing when you were wrong, and not because you wanted forgiveness, but because you wanted growth. He still had moments, pangs of old patterns, shadows of fears that hadn't fully vanished, but he no longer let them make decisions for him. He named them, faced them, and chose differently. Elsie padded outside in bare feet, blanket draped over her shoulders. He turned to her and smiled. She stepped beside him, silent. Together, they watched the light stretch across the treetops. After a while, she asked, "Do you think Leo will like pancakes?" He chuckled softly. "He'll love them." A pause. "You were really scared before," she said matter-of-factly. He nodded. "I was." She leaned into his side. "But you came back." "I did," he whispered, resting his hand gently on her back. "And I'm never leaving again." He meant it. Not because he was finally sure of everything, but because he was finally okay with not needing to be. Love didn't ask for certainty. It asked for honesty, for humility, for effort. Solène had taught him that, not through lectures or ultimatums, but by staying soft in the places where life had turned her hard, and by choosing to believe he could be more than his past. She had been his compass all along, not leading him, but walking with him. He turned and headed inside with Elsie. The house was alive with warmth. Solène looked up from the couch, hair messy, Leo resting on her chest. She smiled, tired, radiant. He looked around at everything he never thought he'd have, everything he almost lost, and whispered, more to himself than anyone else, This is the life I want." The wind moved gently through the trees outside the cottage. Inside, laughter came in waves, soft, shared, warm. Reese sat at the kitchen table, Leo asleep against his shoulder, Elsie perched across, from him dipping her fingers into honey, and Solène humming as she prepared breakfast. The moment felt small to anyone outside of it, but to him it felt enormous. A life rebuilt, not from riches or power, but from effort, from presence, from love that had been broken, tested, and chosen again. He leaned back and let the quiet settle. In that stillness, memories crept in like light under a door. Flashback, 6 years ago. He stood alone at a marble balcony overlooking the city. Empty apartment. Silence so thick it rang. Flashback, divorce hearing. Solenne's eyes never met his. Elsie held tightly to her hand. His heart screamed, but his lips stayed sealed. Flashback, park bench, Elsie's birthday. Her hand over her stomach. That quiet pause, her voice steady. This one is mine to carry. Back to present. Solène slid a cup of coffee in front of him. He smiled, grateful in a way he hadn't known he could be. She brushed her fingers along his knuckles as she passed, a small act, yet enough to anchor him again. The narrator's voice returned, gentle and deep. Some stories don't begin with a first kiss. They begin with a failure, a fall, a silence so loud, you don't realize it's the start of something different. It waits, it watches, it holds its breath until two people are ready to see each other clearly again. Rhys and Solène weren't perfect. They were prideful, wounded, stubborn, but the love between them didn't vanish. It matured, it sat quietly until they had the courage to reach for it. Rhys had been so afraid to become a father, to fail where his own had disappeared. That fear turned into armor, and armor turns love into a battlefield. But when he let himself be seen, at the ultrasound, with Leo at midnight, painting nursery walls in silence, he healed. Not because Solène demanded it, but because love invited him to. It wasn't the court dates or the final arguments that reshaped their path. It was the whispered apologies over coffee, the small home with creaking steps, Leo's first laugh, the way Elsie fell asleep on Solène's lap while Rhys read aloud. These were the bricks that rebuilt what had crumbled. Elsie didn't know she was healing two broken adults. Her laughter was a reminder. Her innocence, a mirror. She was never a pawn. She was always the reason. Had Rhys clung to the belief that he needed to win, that being right meant being whole, he would have lost everything. But choosing humility, buying a modest cottage, apologizing without expectation, showing up, it changed everything. It brought him home. The richest man is not the one who has everything, but the one who chooses love again and again. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe, because more stories like this are on the trail.